Hello everyone and welcome back to ExtremeRigs.net. I am Stran and today we're going to be looking at water cooling options for your GTX 980 graphics card from NVIDIA. This particular model is the EVGA Superclock version, which comes with a slightly different cooler and no backplate. So one of the options we're going to be reviewing today is a block from Alphacool. Alphacool are a little unusual in their water blocks in that after making a bunch of full cover water blocks, they decided to switch to a different business model, whereby they would have a central reusable core cooler, and then they would manufacture these additional aluminum plates that it would attach to. So if we look at the back, you'll see that there's a core that actually cools the core of your GPU. And then you have all these thermal pads on here. These ones are for memory, these ones are for VRMs, and these are for other crappy little chips that probably don't need to be cooled. And all of these thermal pads stick to this huge aluminum, basically heatsink. And so, you know, your core cooling is going to be very good, but then depending on your airflow and depending on how good the thermal connection is between this aluminum plate and the block itself, the cooling of the rest may not be as good. Now, one of the problems, we actually reviewed this on the AMD card, the R9 and the version for that we had problems with the backplate. So let's look at the backplate real quick. When you buy this, it does always come with a backplate, which is nice because some cards, some coolers, you have to also pay extra for the backplate as well. So as you can see, there's a crap load, an absolute crap load of thermal pads on the back here too. So, you know, Alphacool are kind of doing everything they can to provide good cooling to the other circuits on the board. The downside is these are still really thick thermal pads. These are about 3 millimeters thick. And here's the thing with thermal pads. You know, like any resistance, the resistance is proportional to the length divided by the area. While there's a lot of area here, the length or the thickness of the pad is quite high. So, you know, the thickness is really going to hurt these thermal pads. If we go to see the actual backplate itself here, you'll see there's now cutouts on here. This is the same thickness as the old backplate, but they've merely machined some sections out of here so that it's compatible. And that was the problem we saw in the 290X, that the backplate could no longer get in slot 1 in certain motherboards, like the ASUS motherboards, for example. This one now does, and we've confirmed that. The only thing it does stop you from doing is mounting, you know, if you've got something that takes up a full slot, this still sticks out too much to let that sit immediately by it. So backplate's definitely improved, generally compatible, but there may still be instances where you have problems. So let's get on to the performance. I like to look at the flow performance first, so we're going to show some plots on the screen. We have a lot of info on the side about the block, but essentially on this plot the highest line is the worst. So in other words, this is measuring back pressure of the block. In other words, how much pump power is it going to take to force the water through the block itself. And the core cooling block here, which is the only thing the water goes through, is very, very restricted. I mean, you know, at least 5 times most of the others. It's got about 4.5 pounds per square inch of back pressure at 1 gallon per minute, which is an awful lot. I mean, that's pretty much your entire D5 pump at maximum. So what does this mean for you? Well, it means that by putting this block in your loop, unless you're running a bunch of these in parallel, the restriction is going to be high enough that it's going to cause your loop flow rate to drop. And what does that mean? By causing your loop flow rate to drop, everything in your loop, the performance of those things will drop. So your CPU block is going to be running at a lower flow rate, which means its cooling is less. Your radiator is going to be running at a lower flow rate, so its ability to dump heat to the air is less. So no matter how good this block does, the fact that it's so restrictive means that the rest of the stuff in your loop is going to suffer. So bear that in mind. Now let's move on to thermal performance. We tested this with and without the supplied thermal interface, or TIM as we call it. Tim's a good buddy of mine. So when we test it to just test the block performance, we test with AquaTuning's MX02. It's very quick to cure, so time-wise it's a lot easier for testing. It's very spreadable. It's just a very good TIM for cooling. It's not necessarily the best, but it's good for us. And what we found was that this gave us the absolute best core cooling performance with that TIM. And then we tried it with the supplied TIM, and that gave us the opposite result. That said, this is the absolute worst performance out of everyone. So yeah. So what does this mean? It means, for a start, the supplied TIM probably isn't that good. So you probably want to use an aftermarket TIM. The other thing it means is that the core is really good. Now sometimes we see restrictive products where that restriction isn't put to good use. They're restrictive and they're bad. This one is at least restrictive and the performance it brings is good. The VRM cooling is a different story. As we suspected, because the VRMs aren't directly cooled by water, they're instead cooled through a thermoplat to this aluminum plate, which is then connected to the block kind of on the side with some tin itself. It's kind of an indirect cooling path. So as you'd expect, this did poorly on VRM temperatures. But having said all of this, those temperatures are not very extreme. The GTX 980 is such a low power card that it doesn't really matter. It's still going to be better than air cooling, but even with air cooling, the card runs very cool. It's such a low power card, and NVIDIA has throttled the power limit so much that you're never going to really be worrying about temperatures on this card. So overall, to summarize it, the core cooling is very good. The VRM cooling is a little low. The restriction is pretty awful. The price, however, is pretty good. If you buy it with the block, it's going to be $100, and that includes the backplate. If you compare that to a regular water blocks will run about $110 to $140, and they usually don't include a backplate, which will be $25 to $40 on top of that. So you can pay up to $180 for water block and backplate. So coming in at 100 is very good. Now, if you've bought one of these before, you'll already have the core, in which case you can buy just the back plate and the front plate and new thermal pads to go with it. So that option is about $45, I think. So that saves you a lot of money there. So if you're someone that upgrades cards very often and you're okay with the restriction implications, this is very good for you. The last thing to note, quality-wise, the paint is great. The thing we didn't like was the mounting hardware. For start, there's two different types of screw that hold the back plate, that clamp the back plate to the front plate. One is kind of silvery, like a dark silver, and then one is black. And it was confusing why you would use two different colors of screw. Secondly, the metal in the screws is really soft. It's kind of cheap, crappy screws, to be honest. And so when you screw them in, they're also an Allen key head. So it's not like a head that's going to have a lot of grip anyway. So you're using a crappy Allen key, you're using a crappy metal in the head itself. And then a lot of those heads would have a lot of paint in them. So sometimes you can even get the Allen key in there. So, there's definite things that can be improved with the Alphacool design. But for certain niche people who change blocks a lot, this is a good product. For a lot of other people, it's probably not the right product. So stay tuned, we're going to be reviewing a lot of the other 980 options. We've already done all the testing, so now we're just kind of rounding them all up for you. That's it for me.